which means we're going to do it in blocks. So when you look at your handouts, you'll see that we're set up in blocks. You look at your schedule, you'll see we're set up in blocks. Eventually, those will be edited into single training sessions. Does that make sense? So we are going to do questions and answers afterwards. We want to make sure you get all your questions answered. If we end up that we're down to the end and we don't have time for every one of these blocks, we'll figure out how to do it another time. You've still got the content here. It's more important probably to make sure we have the complete conversation around any questions that you have. If you have a question that you feel is a little bit sensitive, remember this is going to be edited and we'll be sensitive to that. So ask your sensitive question, make your comment in any way that you normally would. We'll edit out anything. If you're really worried about it, you can say off the record and we'll know we have to edit it out, okay? Do keep those side conversations down because Bill is going to have to make this all work at the end, and so we need to make sure that we have all that clean sound so that he can have that going. I guess the other thing that I want to just mention is that this training is part of what you want to put together for your board in a planned format. And we didn't put a plan together for you here, we just put together the training segments. But you're going to want to actually probably look at your board calendar. I suggest to all centers that they do a board calendar anyway, and that you do a January through December or July through, whatever, October through what, but do your year. And then put a topic for training on each of those days. Sometimes it will also fit with something else. So when you're about time for your audit, maybe the one before that audit review is going to be your how to review a financial statement. That might be a good time every year to review that, right? Maybe the review of the bylaws might be in there even though we're not doing that here. You might want to put that on your agenda regularly so that it always happens in, August of every year or whatever month you decide. But you want a plan. RSA will expect that when they come out. They expect a board training plan and a staff development plan. They expect it to be written, and they expect for you to have it documented in some way. Now with boards, we usually think, well, the minutes, the agenda, and the minutes and the names of people there, that should be enough in the minutes. That probably is. With staff, they're probably going to want to see a sign-in sheet of some sort with content attached behind it, with some kind of documentation to say, yes, indeed, people were there and they attended the training. So we're giving you pieces of training here, but you're going to have to pull it together into a whole. And you're going to have to make that whole fit your center and fit what you typically do in the center itself. So we're going to look at some general things about the board. Do they understand their roles and responsibility, their legal responsibilities, the need to develop future board members, the responsibilities for attending regularly scheduled meetings. These are the ones that show up the most often in the RSA reviews. So most often when boards are not doing their job, the finding has wording around one of these issues, that they don't understand their roles and responsibilities or some of these other things. Also often that they don't understand independent living philosophy. So one of the things you may want to look at as a general rule is a two-tiered system of board training. Orientation for new board members is just as important as ongoing training for existing board members, right? So you want to make sure that that new person can come into the meeting with some understanding of who you are and what you're doing. Otherwise, some really interesting things can happen. And I bet we've all seen this happen. You recruit a board member and you say to them, we really want you because of your accounting expertise. And then they come in and they think that you want them to be your second accountant, and they try to, offer their help, but it isn't exactly what you really had in mind. Or you say to somebody, we really want you for your personnel expertise, and then they come onto your board and suddenly they want to go interview all your staff to see if they're happy. No, that isn't why you asked them to come on the board. We need to be really clear, and the best place to do that is at your orientation. So if you actually take the time to put together a sample board packet or your last board packet, it doesn't matter, how the agenda works, how to submit a topic, how early the information is going to get to them, how early they have to have it then to you if they want on the agenda, And some of the items that we're going to have in training, how to review a financial report, you probably want to do a quick review of that and do a more thorough one later in another training. But do you see how much better it is for a person to come on the board if you have some of these pieces already in place, and then they're able to know right out of the gate that this is what is expected of you and this is how we want you to come in. Often that includes written descriptions of the duties of the different officers and committees, and often you have an expectation that they serve on one or more committees, so this is a good time for that conversation, you know, about what committee they might be most interested in, and then the chair will probably appoint them to a committee shortly. They need copies of the legal documents, because if they don't have a copy of the bylaws, that's what you're operating by legally, so you need to have that in their hands. You need to make sure that they have, if you have a written code of ethical conduct, you need to make sure they have that. Often you want to have them sign that. Usually your policy and procedure addresses this, and you have an ethical code of conduct of some sort. There's lots of samples on the internet. I can give you some samples if you want. Those ethical codes of conduct include the conflict of interest piece, and that conflict of interest piece is in the standards and indicators that are reviewed by both RSA and KRS. So you would expect something to be asked about that, and this ethical code of conduct can easily cover that issue. And you want all this up front because they need to know their legal responsibilities from the get-go. And rather than sitting kind of quietly at the meeting and wondering what they're doing there, you know, they can be much more of a participant if you can do this. And then, as I mentioned, consider adding each of these topics to an annual schedule, because some board members are not going to remember what you told them about a financial statement because they had a lot to absorb that first meeting when you did their orientation, just like staff, right? They have a lot to absorb, and so then you have to come back and revisit it later and say, okay, you know, here's how we do it. So consider adding that to a regular schedule so that everybody gets a refresher. Now, we also looked at regular training in services, and some organizations will do the short topic at every meeting, and I think that's kind of the reason for the model that we're using today. Other centers will use an annual retreat. They combine both training and planning sometimes, so they'll do a training segment and then they'll roll into the strategic planning piece. You're required to have a 3-year written plan of some sort as a part of your grants, and so a lot of times that's combined, rolled in together there. And some do both. They have something every week or every month, but they also have an annual time when they kind of do whatever's more intensive. And if there's a specific new thing that's going on, great time for them to really focus on how that's going to develop as part of the strategic planning. So you might think about those models. Also, you may want to look at an outline of board policies and procedures or operations and procedures. Interestingly enough, board policies are not required. So if you see it written in a report, it's only written in the report as a recommendation, which is a suggestion. You don't have to meet it. A finding you have to correct, and a recommendation you don't. So when RSA comes in and reviews LINC in a few weeks, what they're going to find around board policies and procedures, if you find any board policies and procedures, you're very happy because that's not required. They like to see them, but it isn't in the requirements themselves, which I think is very odd, but it's the reality. So we suggest that you still do that you still have written documents about how the board operates and outline what the board does, because that's it's a lot of good information for your new board members. Also, when you look at the information you want to provide, you want to give them good contact information. So you want to tell them, it's great to text me, or it isn't great to text me, because some people love it, some people hate it, right? I'm always able to respond to email. I'm not always able to respond to phone. Feel free to email me anytime. Whatever the best communication method is with both the board president and the executive director, which is usually who the board member would be working with. Perhaps a committee member if you've got a staff member working with a committee. But they need that contact information, and probably for each other, so that they can, ride the meetings together, or whatever it is that they want to do to collaborate. Also provide them with information about the organization that's public information that you've put together. So it might be your brochures, it might be your newsletters, it might be your website address, it might be a screenshot off your website so that they can kind of take a look at it during the conversation if you don't have a way to pull it up. And one thing that I've seen some organizations do, which I love, not everybody goes there, is a way or a system for filing the board minutes and the board packets. Sometimes that's as simple as giving them a banker's box that has your name on the side of it, so they can drop their packets in there and keep them in an organized place. Sometimes what you're going to say to them is, this orientation notebook that I just gave you contains important information, and anytime we give you new policies and procedures, it's going to go in that book. And you may just use the notebook itself. Your orientation notebook itself is the key document that you provide to them. But when an organization provides that filing system to a board member, often the board will comment on that to me. They'll say, we really were impressed because we've been on boards before and we've never had this kind of service, but they really want us to be in the know about the organization because look, they've been helping us organize that information. So that's kind of a cool, cool way to take a look at actually doing that. And then the topics that we're doing today are the ones that you chose as important for your board. We're adding some information that's been cited in reviews of other CILs that might give you some sense of kind of where RSA's emphasis on the review process is going. And that's kind of the idea around where we're going today. So any questions about the process? Whoops, and what we're covering? Okay, this first topic is history of independent living. Now here's the reality. The definitive document out there on the history and philosophy of independent living was authored by Gina McDonald and Mike Oxford. And it's still out there and it's still around because, history is history, right? The real old days don't change much. And so I'm going to hit a little bit of history. We're going to watch a short video as part of this. But one of the things we need to remember is that we have a resource who can give us a lot of commentary here. So at some point we may have questions to aim at Gina, or Gina might just not be able to help herself and want to say something. So wave your hand if that's the case and we'll make sure that happens. This is the short version. There is a lot more information online. We have 4 DVDs, one of which we're going to look at. They are older technology, and we're doing some work to update that. There is also a lot of YouTube stuff out there. If you guys haven't seen all the YouTube videos of the different leaders in independent living talking about the different aspects of it, it's really excellent stuff. And there's a lot of that out there that you can pull in and use. But whenever I put it in my presentations, my boss always asks me why I'm not using the DVDs from our website. So. And I want to say to him, well, they can be a little brainy. They can. Anyway, the Independent Living Act movement actually was begun in the late 60s and early 70s, and it happened in different places around the country at the same time. The one we hear about the most was Ed Roberts at Berkeley in the 60s. Now, if you lived during the 60s, I know some of you are too young to know this, but if you lived during the 60s, Berkeley in 60s kind of leads to a certain viewpoint about political activity, because there was a lot of political activity going on, not just in Berkeley, other places too. So the fact that this movement emerged during the 60s is really not that unusual. There was a lot of activity around rights and around different kinds of services and the different kinds of access issues going on across the country. So the Civil Rights Act was passed when? In 1964, right? 65. I always get mixed up on that one. 64, right? Yeah, Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. We were talking about access to what? Schools, buses, all kinds of things. Does that sound familiar at all? Anyway, so suddenly we began to see things differently. We began to see things we had kind of taken for granted as oh, you mean I have the right to that? I talked to a man who was one of the rolling quads with Ed Roberts on the Berkeley campus. He lives in the Bay Area, and he came into this training for us, a local training for us. And he said, you know, I grew up in a fairly well-to-do family. He used a wheelchair from the time he was, 7 or 8, so he grew up in the school system. He said our school was built in such a way that the first floor had kindergarten, first and second grade, and third grade, and then the upper grades were on the upper floor. That's the way it was built. And he said they built me a ramp to get me up into this first floor. And I was small enough that, toileting was a big issue in grade school because everybody could help me out because, we didn't have to worry about accessibility because it was little kids. But when it came time to graduate to the 4th grade, he said we never even thought that we might ask that they move the 4th grade to the first floor. Never occurred to us. He said it didn't even cross our minds. Now, isn't that a bizarre thought today? But he said, you've got to picture, it was a time where we were just, we didn't want to put anybody out. And wasn't it nice of them to carry me up the stairs every day, And he said it didn't make any sense, but we weren't thinking in terms of rights. And that it was a different time. By the time the 60s came along, not just the civil rights movement, but also the women's movement, other movements around the country were beginning to have us think differently. IL responds to the belief that people with disabilities should be able to exert control over their own lives and make their own decisions about what affects people. And the centers became available through funding in the 70s and 80s through the Rehab Act. Some of the centers here in Kansas, we wrote our grant in 78 and we were first funded in 79 at Link. Came about very early in this process. And have continued that funding both through direct Part C grants and the Part B grants that some of you get. Those funds became available, but there were centers before that, and that's the thing that we sometimes forget. We sometimes forget that before those first 10 states got funding from the Rehab Act, there were centers in a number of states, California, Texas, Ohio, Colorado for some, that were already beginning to formulate what a center ought to look like, and what should a center do, and how should it develop, and how could it be a part of the growth out of the community of people with disabilities in that given community. Oops, wrong way, sorry. So as we said, the other social change movements contributed greatly to what happened then in the independent living movement. Consumerism, if you don't know what that is, that's Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed. See, I'm dating myself again. It was the right as a consumer to expect safety and quality in a product that you buy. Before that, there were no consumer service personnel at the local store. You didn't get to return stuff if it didn't work. We forget all this, but it was also a social change movement that was going on. The demedicalization, deinstitutionalization movement in the developmental disabilities world was a part of this. We were saying people should be able to live in the community, not live out in that institution out at the edge of town, but should instead be a part of their communities. And that was part of what was going on and beginning to go on. That mostly came from parents of people with developmental disabilities, although in the mental health world, it was coming also from people who had mental health concerns. And they were able to begin to see things differently. Now, independent living is not a medical model. Sometimes we get ourselves all trapped up in this, but a few brief thoughts about what that means. So in a medical model, the individual with a disability is what? A patient or a client with medical or other professionals making the decision. The medical field has gotten a little better about at least some pieces around this, but you still see that doctors feel like they have, they have the answer, whether you know it or not. And sometimes you have to talk back to your doctor. Now we will. Back then we didn't. We just didn't talk back to the doctor. So we look at it differently. We use the term consumer. I hear a lot of people say, oh, I want to change the term to, whatever, something else. Language is important. We chose consumer intentionally because remember that consumer movement that was going on, right? So there was a kind of situation where we said, okay, this is a person who actually has the right to receive from us a certain service or product with all the rights that go along with having, being in charge of that purchase or that type of service. So that was the thought behind that. In the medical profession, then it's the doctor or the clinician, whoever it is, that runs things, controls the plan, sets the course, and in independent living, it's the consumer who does that. It's a very different viewpoint when we look at it. In desired outcomes, the medical model is for maximum self-care, gainful employment, a cure. In independent living, we approach it from a different direction. We still may end up with maximum self-care, gainful employment, but we approach it from the direction of how can the person have control and make those day-to-day decisions around living and have a good quality of life while they do it in a community-based environment. And the reality is that if you go to some of you might have this experience, if you go to a physical therapist after an injury, they're going to teach you how to put on your socks and how to do whatever. And you might want to hire an attendant to do that because it takes too dang long and you want to get to work in the morning on time, right? So there's the difference between the medical model, which wants you to do these pieces according to a physical therapist plan, and the model of, hey, I'm in charge of my life and I decide what's worth it to spend my time on. And I may rearrange my time in a way that I have assistants doing some of those things that are just tedious for me because I want to use my energy for something else. Does that make sense? So that's part of the difference between the independent living and the medical model. Now we're going to look at a short video. This is called Emergence of Independent Living, and it's one of those 4 videos that I was talking about just a moment ago. So let's take a quick second and look at that.